Okay, so our last video of blood clotting. This is going to be very quick, only a few minutes. So what's happening? So how to prevent or treat thrombotic conditions? Because we know that this is really important and it can cause blood clot unnecessarily and that can lead to serious problem, life-threatening conditions within our body. So we can take antiplatelet drugs, for example, for arterial thrombosis. There are different types of antiplatelet drugs. The classic examples are aspirin and clopidogrel. Okay, so they mainly prevent arterial thrombosis. They will prevent platelet activation, unnecessary platelet activation. Again, you will study this in too much detail next year. So we need to take antiplatelet drugs for arterial thrombosis, such as heart attack and strokes. So if it is a venous thrombosis, then we need to take anticoagulant drugs. Okay, they are collectively called as antithrombotic drugs. Don't get confused. If it is antithrombotic drugs, within that there will be two classes, antiplatelets and anticoagulant drugs. So the classic example of anticoagulant drugs is called warfarin, and it's mainly given for venous thrombosis. Warfarin mainly will attack the coagulation cascade and it will not do anything to platelets. Similarly, antiplatelet drugs will not do anything to coagulation cascade. So try to understand this clearly. And then fibrinolytic drugs, for example, TPA, tissue plasminogen activator. We talked about this before. This is really important enzyme that converts plasminogen into plasmin, and plasmin is the clot dissolving enzyme. So there's a commercial name called alteplase. It's recombinantly produced, and this enzyme can be given to dissolve the clot very quickly, particularly in case of stroke. If somebody had an ischemic stroke and if they are coming to the hospital within 4.5 hours, they will give this enzyme. This enzyme will go and cleave the blood clot and rescue the blood supply very quickly. So these are the main medication used to prevent and treat thrombosis. So, okay, next, what is the pathological conditions associated with the blood clot? So one is unnecessary clotting or excessive clotting. The other one is obviously bleeding or hemorrhage. Okay, so how the hemorrhage or bleeding is happening? So mainly this is happening because of thrombocytopenia. If somebody got reduced amount of platelets, that's the condition called thrombocytopenia. We talked about this in the last lecture. So now they don't have enough amount of platelets and therefore they cannot make blood clot. It's a reduced level of platelets. The cause could be anything. It could be due to immunosuppressive drugs or immune diseases, or there could be related to genetic factors. So basically they don't have enough amount of platelets. If they don't have a sufficient amount of platelets, they can't clot the blood quickly. Therefore they will bleed for a long time. Then the next problem is impaired synthesis of clotting factors. So the clotting factors are mainly produced in the liver. And if there is a problem with the liver, for example, chronic liver condition, cirrhosis, this type of diseases, or any drugs, then the clotting factor production will be affected. If you don't have a sufficient amount of clotting factors, for example, factor 8, that's a genetic problem, then it will lead to bleeding, because the coagulation cascade is not happening, even though the platelet clot is formed, but that's only temporary. It's not a stable clot. So the bleeding will occur in these people. So that's due to impaired synthesis of coagulation factors. Then the next is hereditary disorders. For example, hemophilia A, which means it's a deficiency of factor 8. These people will not have sufficient amount of factor 8 in their blood. And without factor 8, the clotting cascade cannot go, particularly the intrinsic pathway cannot go. So it's really important to have this factor. And then von Willebrand disease, which means they will not have sufficient amount of von Willebrand factor. This is another factor important for platelet activation and the platelet aggregation. So if this factor is insufficient in somebody's blood, then they are likely to bleed for a long time. So what could be the treatment for these people? So for treatment for these people is infusion of platelets. So if they don't have sufficient amount of platelets, we need to infuse platelets from donors into the recipients. Then they will circulate the platelets in sufficient level all the time. But you need to remember the lifespan of platelets will be only 5 to 10 days. Therefore, they need to take infusion at a regular intervals. And then infusion of appropriate clotting factors. These days, most of the clotting factors are produced recombinantly in bacteria and cell lines. So therefore, they can be infused based on whatever the deficiency they have. So these are the treatments available to prevent bleeding. So in summary, in this lecture, we talked about the 5 important stages of blood clotting and how each stage is playing critical role in order to prevent the bleeding, excessive bleeding, and to remove the blood clot later on to promote wound healing, and what are the negative feedback regulations both for platelet side and for coagulation side. So we talked about the importance of blood clotting because if there is an injury, blood must clot. There is no excuse here, otherwise bleeding will occur. So we've gone through all the 5 stages. We talked about the role of platelets and the different stages of activation of platelets and the negative feedback regulation for platelet activation. We talked about intrinsic and extrinsic pathways, common pathways, and why thrombin is really important, why it's acting as a multifunctional enzymes. Then we talked about the negative feedback regulation for intrinsic and extrinsic pathways. Then finally, we talked about the pathologies associated with the blood clotting, both thrombosis and bleeding, and what are their treatments. Okay, and we also talked about the pharmaceutical therapies for blood clotting and bleeding. So again, please go through these lecture slides and this screencast, and I listed some books that you can read to read more about the blood clotting. But it's really, both of them are really easy lectures. But if you don't understand any particular aspect, please feel free to contact me and I'm happy to go through them. And you can also send me questions that I can go through during our tutorial sessions. So thank you so much. And again, I hope to see you at some point soon. Thank you.